The courtroom smelled of old wood and bureaucracy, and Philip Dunn's laughter cut through both like something sharp and deliberate. He didn't bother lowering his voice. That was the thing about Philip. He had never once in 11 years of marriage felt the need to lower his voice around Clara Oswin. He stood at the petitioner's table in his charcoal suit, one hand resting on his lawyer's shoulder like a man who owned not just the room but every person in it, and he laughed. "Your Honor," he said, loud enough for the entire courtroom gallery to absorb every syllable, "my wife has no legal representation. None. She walked into Ontario Superior Court on the most important day of her life without a single advocate beside her." He let the pause breathe, generous with his contempt. "I'd almost feel sorry for her, but honestly, this is Clara we're talking about. She probably couldn't find a lawyer willing to take the case." Soft, complicit laughter rippled through the gallery behind him. Gemma Tate, Philip's colleague, and the woman who had spent the last 2 years in the apartment Philip kept on King Street West, sat in the second row with her legs crossed and a small smile on her face that Clara would remember for a very long time. Clara Oswin sat alone at the respondent's table, with her hands flat against the wood, pressing down as if to keep herself from floating away. Her coat was the wrong one. She'd grabbed it in a hurry that morning, the old wool one with the loose button, and under the fluorescent light, it looked exactly as defeated as she felt. She had rehearsed what she would say. She had written notes on index cards and memorized them on the subway ride up from Leslieville. None of it mattered now. Her cheeks burned. Philip's lawyer, a man named Douglas Kerr who wore cufflinks shaped like scales of justice, and meant it as a compliment to himself, patted a stack of documents and began to speak. The stack was thick, precise, immaculate. Months of preparation pressed into paper, designed to take everything from her. The house, the joint savings account she hadn't been able to access in over a year, the quiet contributions she'd made to the early years of his business, when he had nothing, and she still believed in him. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Mrs. Oswin, if you have no representation, the court will proceed." Clara opened her mouth. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Every head turned. It was the kind of entrance that comes from a person who has no interest in drama but commands it anyway. A tall man in a navy suit, briefcase in one hand, moving through the center aisle with the calm, unhurried confidence of someone who has walked into difficult rooms for a living. He was perhaps 10 years older than Clara. His jaw held a familiar angle. Something about the way he paused when his eyes found her at the respondent's table. Something about the way his shoulders settled made her breath catch without knowing why. He approached the bench. "Your Honor, I apologize for the timing. Victor Oswin, counsel of record for Ms. Clara Oswin, effective immediately." He placed his card on the clerk's desk with the ease of a man filing a grocery receipt. "I ask the court's permission to proceed on her behalf." Philip's smile died on his face like a candle snuffed out. Douglas Kerr sat up straighter. Victor Oswin was not simply a lawyer. He was a senior partner at one of the most respected family law firms on Bay Street, the kind of firm whose name on a filing made opposing counsel read everything twice. He had appeared before the Ontario Court of Appeal 12 times and won 11. Clara had never seen him before in her life. The judge nodded. "The court will allow. Mr. Oswin, you may proceed." Philip's chair scraped against the floor as he leaned toward Douglas Kerr and whispered something harsh. Behind him, Gemma Tate uncrossed and recrossed her legs and stared at the stranger who had just walked her certainty into question. Victor set his briefcase on the respondent's table and sat beside Clara. He kept his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're not facing this alone anymore." "Who are you?" Clara whispered. He looked at her directly. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green she had not seen since she was 9 years old. Someone who should have come back sooner. Her heart lurched against her ribs. The recess came 40 minutes later, called after a procedural objection. They filed out into the marble hallway of Osgood Hall, and Clara stood by the tall arched windows overlooking the courtyard, where bare November trees made black lines against a pale Toronto sky. Victor stood a few feet away, speaking quietly with a junior clerk. She studied his profile, the shape of his nose, the way he held a pen loosely between 2 fingers when he wasn't using it. She had blocked out so many memories from that time. The last year before she was placed, before the social worker came and everything fractured. That whole seasons of her childhood had the quality of photographs left too long in a window. Faded, overexposed, hard to trust. She hadn't let herself think about her brother in a long time. It was easier not to. Philip appeared from a side door. He had buttoned his suit jacket and restored the performance of control, but his eyes gave him away. "You hired him?" he said quietly, stepping close enough that no one else would hear. "Where did you even find the money for a Bay Street firm?" He said it with the particular cruelty of a man who knew exactly that she had no sister, no mother, no one left to call. Or is this some kind of scheme? Because if you think a borrowed lawyer is going to change anything— "He wasn't borrowed," Victor said, appearing at Clara's side so smoothly that Philip flinched. "And I'd recommend you stop speaking directly to my client." Philip stared at him. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Philip Dunn," Victor said pleasantly, "born in Burlington. First company dissolved for unpaid taxes in 2014. Second company, Dunn Property Group, currently under a quiet internal audit. You prefer the aisle seat on Air Canada, and you charge personal expenses to the business account on the 3rd of every month." He tilted his head slightly. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Philip's face went the color of old milk. He walked away without another word. Victor turned back to Clara. "We should talk before we go back in." They sat on a bench at the far end of the hall. Outside, a gust of wind stripped the last leaves from the courtyard trees and sent them spinning in small, frantic circles. "Tell me how you found me," Clara said. It came out less steady than she intended. Victor was quiet for a moment. "I aged out of the system at 17. By then you'd been placed twice more, and I had no access to the records. I put myself through school. Articled with a firm in Ottawa, came to Toronto. Every few years I'd hire someone to search." He looked at her. 6 months ago I finally got a name, and then I heard you'd filed for divorce, and that Philip was pushing for a fast ruling before you could find representation." His voice was steady but carried something underneath it. "I wasn't going to let that happen." Clara's throat closed. She had spent 11 years in a marriage that slowly convinced her she was fortunate to be there. Philip had not always been cruel in obvious ways. It was quieter than that. He talked over her at dinners. He forgot things she told him about her day and remembered every detail about his own. He had ways of making her feel that her instincts were wrong, that her perception was unreliable, that gratitude was the appropriate response to being chosen. She had believed him for a long time. She had believed him right up until the morning she found the second phone. "I don't know how to trust this yet," she admitted. "That's fair," Victor said. "You don't have to. Just let me do my job today." Back inside the courtroom, something had shifted in Douglas Kerr's posture. He no longer held himself with the relaxed authority of a man presenting a foregone conclusion. He shuffled papers. He cleared his throat twice before speaking. "Your Honor," continuing from the petitioner's position, "Philip Dunn is seeking equitable division of assets, with recognition that the primary financial contributions to this marriage were made by the petitioner." "Objection," Victor said. "Counsel is characterizing the financial record without submitting the full record." "The full record is before the court." "The disclosed record," Victor said, "which is not the same thing." The judge looked up. "Mr. Oswin, elaborate." Victor opened his briefcase and placed a bound document on the clerk's desk with the measured calm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Your Honor, I've reviewed the financial disclosures submitted by the petitioner. They are incomplete. Specifically, they omit a numbered account held through a company called DPG Holdings, registered in New Brunswick, which received transfers totaling approximately $430,000 over the last 3 years. A murmur moved through the gallery. Philip shot upright. "That account has nothing to do with the marriage. It was funded using revenue from Dunn Property Group during the marriage," Victor said without looking at him. "I can walk the court through the transfer history if helpful." Douglas Kerr leaned close to Philip and put a hand on his arm. Philip shook it off. "He's making things up," Philip said, louder than he intended. "There's nothing to hide. This is a manipulation." He turned toward Clara with something wild in his eyes. Tell them you're doing this to punish me. That's all this is. Mr. Dunn, the judge's voice was flat. Sit down. He sat. His hands were shaking. Victor continued without pause. The second document was a lease agreement. The apartment on King Street West, the one that appeared nowhere in the financial disclosures, had been rented using a personal account and expensed monthly to the business as client hospitality. The tenant named on the lease was Gemma Tate. In the second row of the gallery, Gemma Tate went very still. The value of that lease over 31 months, combined with the associated expenses documented on the corporate card, represents a significant marital asset that was deliberately withheld, Victor said. He slid a second bound document across the clerk's desk. I've also included a sworn statement from a former assistant at Dunn Property Group, who confirms that Ms. Oswin was discouraged from pursuing contract work through Mr. Dunn's professional network on 3 separate occasions. Phone records and emails are attached. Clara's breath stopped. She had wondered about those 3 contracts. She had interviewed well. She had followed up carefully. Nothing had come of any of them. Philip had told her the market was competitive. He had told her she needed to build a stronger portfolio. He had told her, gently and with apparent regret, that perhaps teaching was simply more suited to her temperament than contract work. She looked at him now from across the aisle. He was looking at the table. Your Honor, Victor said, his voice unhurried and precise. My client did not arrive at this court empty-handed because she had nothing. She arrived without a lawyer because her husband spent 4 years ensuring she would have no professional network, no financial independence, and no confidence in her own judgment. Today, I am asking this court to see the full picture. The judge called another recess. In the hallway, Clara found a bench near a window and sat down heavily. The sky had darkened. The first fine snow of November was beginning to fall on the courtyard below, light and indifferent, dusting the cobblestones white. She pressed her palms against her thighs to keep them steady. Everything Philip had ever said to her, every quiet correction, every slight redirection, every conversation that ended with her feeling smaller than she'd entered it, she had filed away as evidence of her own inadequacy. She had thought she was the problem. She had thought his frustration with her was proportionate, that her failure to find stable contract work was her own failing, that her growing sense of isolation was simply her nature. She had thought she was lucky to have him. Victor sat beside her. He didn't speak for a moment. You look like him, Clara said finally. When you turned toward the judge, just before the first recess, there was a moment when you looked exactly like I remember. The frown, he said. The frown. Something eased between them, not healed, not whole, but possible. Why did they separate us, she asked. He was quiet long enough that she knew the answer was complicated. Dad wasn't safe, he said at last. You were removed because they found evidence against him. I ran because I thought if I stayed, something worse would happen. He looked at his hands. I was 15. I thought running was protecting you. I was wrong about that. Clara closed her eyes. She had spent over 2 decades believing she had been abandoned by the only family she knew. She had built her adult life on top of that abandonment. The quietness of it, the way it had trained her to expect to be left and therefore try to be very small, very convenient, very grateful for whatever she was given. She saw now how legible that must have been to someone like Philip. How easy she must have looked. When the court reconvened, Philip attempted one final maneuver. Douglas Kerr stood and announced they wished to submit what he called evidence of a pattern of emotional instability on Clara's part. Therapy records, obtained through a consent form, Philip had signed on her behalf 3 years earlier, presented to establish that she was an unreliable party to a financial settlement. Victor was on his feet before the sentence was complete. Your Honor, those records were obtained without Ms. Oswin's knowledge or informed consent, in direct violation of PHIPA. Their submission would constitute a serious privacy breach. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the Information and Privacy Commissioner's office this afternoon. The judge held up a hand. Douglas Kerr sat. Furthermore, Victor said, turning toward the bench with the precise, deliberate calm of a man who has been saving the best argument for last. The use of my client's therapy records to discredit her claim does not diminish the evidence already before this court. It confirms the pattern we have been describing, one of systematic calculated control." He paused. "My client attended therapy because she was struggling in a marriage to a man who was hiding $400,000, funding a separate life, and quietly dismantling her ability to become financially independent. Her anxiety is not a character flaw. It is a reasonable response to a very unreasonable situation." No one in the courtroom made a sound. Philip stared straight ahead. His jaw worked silently. The judge's ruling took less than 40 minutes. Full equitable division of disclosed and undisclosed assets. Restitution for the professionally documented financial harm. Referral of the DPG Holdings account discrepancy to the Ontario Securities Commission for investigation. A formal note on the record regarding the improper acquisition of medical documents. When the gavel came down, Philip Dunn stood very still for a long moment. Then he turned toward Clara with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not anger, not contempt, but something stripped and uncertain. He looked, for the first time, like a man who didn't know what came next. Clara met his gaze and felt nothing except the quiet, specific relief of something being over. Outside, on the front steps of Osgood Hall, the snow had thickened to something real. It settled on the stone railings and on the shoulders of the journalists who had gathered, microphones extended, questions already forming. Victor stood beside her. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I know," Clara said, "and then I want to." She stepped forward. The cameras turned toward her. She was wearing the wrong coat, and she had no prepared remarks, and the snow was catching in her hair. And she stood there in front of a small crowd in the middle of downtown Toronto on a Thursday afternoon in November, and she spoke clearly. "For a long time," she said, "I thought being quiet was the same thing as being grateful. I thought making myself smaller was how I earned my place." She paused. "It wasn't. I want anyone watching this who recognizes that feeling, that slow, daily erosion of who you used to be, to hear this. You are not what he told you. You are not the version of yourself he needed you to believe in." She let out a breath. "There is still time." Philip emerged from a side door and walked quickly toward a waiting car, collar up against the snow. A journalist called his name. He didn't stop. Later, at a cafe on Queen Street West, Clara and Victor sat across from each other with 2 cups of tea going warm between them and 23 years of absence. Neither of them quite knew how to measure yet. "What happens now?" she asked. "With the legal side, a few more filings. The OSC investigation will take time." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "With us? I don't know. I'd like to try." Clara looked out the window. The snow was still falling, coating the city in something quiet and clean, transforming the ordinary streetscape into something it hadn't been an hour before. "I'd like to try too," she said. There had been a long stretch of her life when she'd thought trust was something you either had or didn't. Constitutional, like blood type. She understood now that it was more like the snow. It came when it came, accumulated slowly, and, if you let it settle long enough, it changed the whole shape of everything you thought you knew. She was 38 years old. She had a brother she hadn't spoken to in over 2 decades. She had a marriage that was over and a future she hadn't yet learned the shape of. She had walked into a courtroom that morning in the wrong coat, with index cards she never got to use, believing she was alone. She thought of all the years she had spent, being careful, being small, being grateful for the wrong things. She thought about the moment the courtroom doors had swung open and how the whole room had turned. She had turned too, not because she expected anyone, but because something in her still recognized, after all this time, the particular way her brother filled a doorway. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a person is only ever harmed by their own judgment of an event, not the event itself. Clara had spent years letting Philip's judgment become her own, accepting his version of who she was until she could no longer find the original underneath. Today, quietly, she had reclaimed the right to decide for herself. She picked up her tea and held it with both hands, feeling the warmth come back into her fingers. Outside, the snow kept falling over Toronto, over the courtyard of Osgood Hall, over all the city's ordinary streets, and Clara Oswin, who had walked into a courtroom that morning, believing she was alone, sat across from her brother. And finally, carefully, began to believe otherwise. If something in this story stayed with you, don't let it go when you close the window. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe to Mr. Nathaniel Stories. We'll keep walking through these truths together, one story at a time.